In a few days, a 19-year-old boy is going to walk onto the biggest stage in the world with a number 10 on his back. And on the other side will be, no less, the man who wore that same number for 20 years. This is not a movie script coincidence. This is the 2026 World Cup final, Spain against Argentina, Lamine Yamal against Lionel Messi. But this story is not about the match. It is about what happens inside the head of someone that young, when the entire world is watching, and instead of freezing, he plays as if no one is watching at all. Just 2 years ago, almost no one outside a neighborhood in Mataró knew his name. Today, according to many analysts, he is one of the most decisive footballers on the planet. Today we ask, what built Lamine Yamal psychologically? How does someone train an audacity that most footballers take an entire career to find, if they ever find it at all? Rocafonda does not appear in Barcelona's tourist guides. It is a working-class neighborhood in Mataró, 40 kilometers from the city, known for its diversity and, according to its own residents, for not being an easy place to grow up. That is where Lamine spent much of his childhood, playing football in plazas and streets with other kids from the neighborhood. No coach, no tactics, no one telling him what to do with the ball. Nothing about that setting suggested, at the time, that this boy would end up sharing a pitch with the greatest figures in world football before turning 20. This matters more than it might seem. When a boy plays football freely and improvisationally, without instructions, without fear of making a mistake in front of an evaluating adult, he is developing, without knowing it, something that no structured exercise teaches with the same effectiveness: the ability to make creative decisions in fractions of a second without the filter of, "This is what I'm supposed to do." The kids of Rocafonda were not playing to impress a scout. They played because it was free, because it was there, and because a ball in a plaza does not judge. His parents separate when Lamine is barely 3 years old. His mother, Sheila, originally from Equatorial Guinea, works long shifts in hospitality to support the household. His father, Munir, from Morocco, remains present and is the one who accompanies him for years on the trains between Mataró and Barcelona so he can train in the youth academies. Both of them, in different ways, sustain something fundamental in any child's psychological development, what attachment psychology calls a secure base. It is not the absence of difficulties. There were difficulties, and many, but the certainty that there is a net holding beneath you. That certainty is, very often, what later allows a teenager to dare to take risks on a pitch without the paralyzing weight of fear of disappointing someone. At 6 or 7 years old, a scout from the local club, CF La Torreta, spots him. Shortly after, the offer from La Masia, Barcelona's youth academy, arrives. The family makes a decision that, told this way, sounds simple, but is psychologically far more complex. They recognize that the neighborhood environment, with its own risks, was not always the safest for his development at that moment, and they decide that the discipline and structure of the academy would give him a more protected path. This is not a story of escaping his roots. It is, on the contrary, a decision made precisely so he could sustain them later from a more solid place. Lamine's grandmother still lives today in Rocafonda, in the same neighborhood as always, and he himself, now one of the most recognizable figures in world sport, insists again and again in every interview that being from the neighborhood has nothing to do with the stereotypes many project onto him from the outside. It means, in his own words, going out to the park with friends, coming home, watching the match in any bar in the neighborhood. That insistence, sustained even when he no longer needs to prove anything to anyone, is in itself an important psychological signal. When someone does not need to distance themselves from their origin in order to feel validated in their new status, it is generally because that original identity was never experienced as something to be ashamed of. At La Masia, Lamine advances through the age groups faster than any other player of his generation. His coaches notice something particular. While other technically gifted kids need to be told what to do in each play, he resolves by instinct with a reading of the game that cannot be explained by training hours alone. It is the same free reading he learned in the plazas of Rocafonda, now placed at the service of a professional system. And there is an image the residents of Mataró still keep with pride. A signed Barcelona shirt, framed on the wall of a bar where he used to stop before catching the train to training. The gift of a boy who even then already knew where he came from and had no intention of forgetting it. In October 2024, at the Ballon d'Or ceremony, he receives the Copa Trophy, the award for the best footballer under 21 on the planet. He is barely a teenager sharing a stage with the greatest figures in world football. And yet, in his words of thanks, the same reference appears as always. The neighborhood, the family, the 304. For someone that age, sustaining exactly the right level of humility at the moment of greatest public recognition is not a minor detail. It is, once again, that same secure base holding the weight of a fame that grows faster than any teenager should have to process. April 2023. Lamine is 15 years, 9 months, and 16 days old when he makes his debut with Barcelona's first team against Real Betis. He is, at that moment, the youngest player in the club's history to wear that shirt in an official match. The coach, Xavi Hernandez, chooses him over players with more experience because, according to the coaching staff, his decision-making already operated at the speed of an adult footballer, even though his body was still that of a teenager. Here, a central concept of youth high-performance psychology emerges: the absence of fear of consequence. A veteran footballer carries, match after match, the accumulated weight of past mistakes, received criticism, contracts, and reputations at stake. That weight, although it generates experience, also generates friction, microseconds of doubt before attempting a risky play. A teenager just arriving does not yet have that accumulated file. It is not that he is braver in an abstract sense. It is that, literally, he has not yet built the same associations between risk and punishment that a 30-year-old player has. That absence of psychological friction, combined with an already elite technical level, produces something that football began calling, in his case, productive audacity. The exact point between useless recklessness and the caution that suffocates creativity. 5 months after his Barcelona debut, in September 2023, he debuts with Spain's senior national team against Georgia, at 16 years and 57 days old. He becomes the youngest international in Spain's history, and he also scores, making him the youngest goal scorer in the history of the national team as well. A year later, at Euro 2024, he breaks another record. Days before turning 17, he becomes the youngest player to score a goal in the history of the competition. Spain goes on to win the tournament, and he takes home the award for Best Young Player. It is worth pausing on something almost never said out loud about precocious talent. Having the gift is not enough. The person's nervous system must also not collapse under the weight of sudden exposure. A great many footballers with comparable talent burn out psychologically when fame arrives before their identity is fully formed. What is interesting about Yamal's case is that, rather than fame rewriting who he is, it seems the foundation built in Rocafonda, that family network, that free and fearless relationship with the game, acts as a kind of anchor that holds his identity steady even as everything around him changes at a speed no teenager should have to process. There is a statistic that illustrates this better than any analysis. Counting both the Euros and the World Cup, Spain never lost a match in which he was a starter. It is the best win percentage as a starter of any European player across both competitions combined. A number like that cannot be explained solely by individual talent. It is explained by consistently stable decision-making in the highest pressure moments, match after match, without the magnitude of the opponent or the weight of the result visibly altering his way of playing. Added to this, in just 3 seasons of professional career are several Liga titles with Barcelona, a Copa del Rey, 2 Spanish Super Cups, and the Zara Trophy for the top-scoring Spanish player in the league in 2026. No footballer accumulates that level of sustained results without some underlying psychological stability, beyond technical ability with the ball. If the previous video on this channel talked about the state of flow in Messi, that fusion of action and awareness that erases conscious effort, in Yamal we find almost the same mental architecture, but with a different nuance. Messi built his flow over 2 decades of deliberate repetition. Yamal seems to have entered that state almost directly from street football, without yet having had time to accumulate the layers of self-criticism that in most adults end up interrupting flow. His constant dribbling, even when he fails publicly, something that statistically occurs more often in his game than in that of more conservative footballers, is in itself a psychological indicator. Only someone with very little fear of external judgment dares to attempt the difficult dribble again and again, match after match, knowing that a large portion of those attempts will go wrong in front of 70,000 people and television cameras from half the world. Tolerance for public failure, sustained without it eroding confidence, is one of the least discussed psychological variables in elite sport, and probably one of the most decisive. Before the 2025-26 season, Barcelona hands him the number 10 shirt, the same shirt that for nearly 2 decades belonged to Lionel Messi. In any sport, inheriting the number of a living legend is psychologically a double-edged weapon. On one hand, it is an enormous recognition. On the other, it is a permanent invitation to comparison. And constant comparison with a near impossible ideal is, according to performance psychology, one of the most direct paths to chronic anxiety in a young athlete. There is even a photograph, taken years earlier, of an already established Messi holding a baby Lamine in his arms. The next Messi narrative did not begin with the number 10 shirt. It had been following him from the cradle. Faced with that kind of pressure, most young footballers react in one of 2 ways. Either they deny it completely, acting as though it does not exist, which tends to generate more internal tension, or they absorb it so literally that they start playing to resemble someone else rather than playing like themselves. Neither route tends to end well in the long run. Yamal seems to have found a third path, and here appears one of the most interesting gestures in this story. Every time he scores a goal, he forms the number 304 with his hands, the last digits of Rockefonda's postal code. It is not an empty superstition. It is, psychologically, an identity anchor, a physical reminder, repeated at the moment of maximum possible euphoria, precisely when it would be easiest to get lost in the character the world is building around him, that his point of reference is not Messi, not the press, not the scoreboard. It is the neighborhood where his grandmother still lives. In April 2026, in a match against Celta de Vigo, he suffers a hamstring injury that keeps him out for the rest of the season. For a 19-year-old footballer in full breakout, an injury like this is not just a physical problem. It is, above all, an emotional regulation challenge. From one day to the next, the control he had over his own body and his own performance disappears, replaced by rehabilitation rooms, medical uncertainty, and the anxiety of missing out on the most important tournament of his career up to that point. The way an athlete tolerates that kind of frustration, without falling into despair or denial, is, very often, a better predictor of professional longevity than any on-field statistic. He arrives at the 2026 World Cup without competitive rhythm, and Spain's coaching staff, in agreement with the club, decide to manage his minutes carefully during the early rounds. This is another psychological test, different from the previous ones. The patience of a player accustomed to being the absolute protagonist, now forced to wait for his moment from the bench. When his first goal in the tournament finally arrives, against Saudi Arabia, at 18 years and 343 days old, he describes it afterward as the fulfillment of a childhood dream. A simple phrase, but a revealing one. Even at the pinnacle of world football, what moves him is still, at its core, the same emotion as that boy playing in a plaza in Rockefonda. In the semi-final against France, now with more physical rhythm, he is one of the central figures of Spain's victory, in a match in which Spain manages to almost completely neutralize one of the most feared attacking lines in the world. This is an interesting contrast with the usual story of the child prodigy. The most common pattern in youth football is that of the precocious talent who burns out psychologically the moment the level of demand rises, too much expectation, too soon, without the emotional foundation to sustain it. Yamal seems to invert that pattern. The bigger the stage, the closer he gets to the same carefree freedom with which he played as a child, rather than moving away from it. On July 13th, the eve of that semi-final, he turns 19. When asked what his ideal gift would be, he answers, without drama, that the only thing he wants is to win and reach the final. The following day, Spain beats France and books their place in their second consecutive final of a major tournament. The birthday wish, the press reports, came true almost immediately. And so we arrive at this Sunday. A boy who 3 years ago was traveling by train from Metero to train at La Masia is going to play a World Cup final against the very footballer whose baby photo he once shared, in a stadium in the New York area, on the other side of the ocean from the neighborhood where everything began. You do not need to know yet how the match ends to understand that, psychologically, the hardest part of this story has already been overcome. Whatever happens on Sunday, there is something the result of the match will not be able to change. A boy from a neighborhood most of the world could not locate on a map 2 years ago arrived at the most demanding stage in sport without ceasing to be in what matters most, the same person who played without fear in a plaza in Mataro. He inherited the number of a legend, and instead of trying to fill that shirt by imitating someone else, found a way to fill it by being completely himself, right down to the gesture with which he celebrates every goal. It is interesting to think that, of the two possible ways to react to an impossible comparison like the next Messi, he chose the one most people don't. He neither denied it desperately nor chased it by trying to imitate a style that was not his own. He simply kept playing the way he played as a kid, and let the rest of the world adjust its expectations to him, rather than the other way around. That is probably the simplest and most difficult definition of what psychology calls sustained authenticity under pressure. Not changing who you are, not when you are compared to an idol, not when you win a youth Ballon d'Or, not when 70,000 people chant your name in the biggest stadium in the world. And that is, perhaps, the lesson most worth taking from this story. Fame, pressure, and comparisons do not automatically destroy anyone. What truly protects a young person under that kind of exposure is having a very clear sense, even in the moment of greatest euphoria, of where they come from and who they are. The question I leave you with then is not about football. What is your 304? That gesture, that place, that person who reminds you of who you truly are when everything around you is changing. If you are interested in this way of looking at sport and the mind, subscribe to the channel. Every week, we break down a real story to find the psychology behind it. See you in the next video.